If you know me personally, you probably know I love strategy games. This basically dead genre has been my jam since I was 6 years old. And the game that I started with? Well, uh, you know what it is. You click the link. You know it's Age of Empires. I don't know why I thought that would be a cool reveal to do. But anyway, yes, Age of Empires. When people think of strategy games, this is usually the first franchise that comes to mind, and the only franchise in the real-time strategy world that's still really going. Age of Empires 4 actually just got released about a year ago. We won't be talking about that. Age of Empires 2 continues to have a thriving player base and gets regular expansion content. It's a fantastic game, and I watch streams of it on a daily basis. Yes, Tristan, I am one of those people who falls asleep listening to your sweet voice screaming about conquistadors and murder holes. We won't be talking about that either. We will be talking about the much maligned third entry to the series. Again, I'm not sure why I thought that would be a cool reveal, but yes, Age of Empires 3 has had a really rocky history, certainly in its own right as a game, with gameplay and game feel and other game things, but also in terms of tone and representation of its content. Because, if you aren't aware, Age of Empires is a historical fiction series. You play as various nations throughout history. In Age of Empires 1, you start from the Stone Age and build your way up into the Iron Age, playing as one of a few well-known literate civilizations in and around the Mediterranean, Fertile Crescent, and East Asia. There aren't very many gameplay differences between the civilizations. It's really just a visual and strategic flavor, and that didn't matter very much because this is ancient history, bordering on prehistory. Your first unit is a literal clubman, and no one cares about Age of Empires 1 anymore anyway. Moving on then to Age of Empires 2. Some more civilization diversity, but still definitely flavor. And while we're now into the feudal era, with a game generally spanning between the 9th and the 16th centuries, there isn't too much flavor-wise to really get critical about. People today don't tend to be affected directly by the stuff that happened in this game's period. Now, there are some exceptions, and I know I said I wouldn't be talking about Age of Empires too much. I do want to use it to at least set up what we'll be talking about in this video. Initially, Age of Empires 2 only included civilizations from Eurasia, going as far west as the Celts and the Britons, as far east as the Japanese, and as far south as the Turks and the Saracens, conveniently, as with the previous entry in the series, leaving out Eastern Europe entirely. But then, in the year 2000, Age of Empires 2 did what all successful games of its time did, and got its expansion. This expansion was named The Conquerors. Oh yes. And it brought with it the Spanish, the Aztecs, and the Mayans. Now, despite the maybe a little tasteless name of the expansion, it was generally pretty okay. In one of the campaigns, you play as the Aztecs, and under Cuauhtémoc, you get to repel the Spanish invasion of Tenochtitlan and preserve the nationhood of the Nahua people. Very cool. But now, listen close. During development, the team also wanted to add the Incas as a playable civilization, but decided against it because the Incas had a rather different architectural style compared to any other civilization in the game, and they neither wanted to just slap an inappropriate coat of paint on this unique nation, nor could they justify at the time a whole architectural style for just one nation. Bits and bytes were expensive back in the days of the CD-ROM. So the Incas would be left out of Age of Empires 2 forever. We would never see this glorious multinational empire of sprawling highways, masterful architecture, expert slingers. Age of Empires 2 would have to go on without Inca representation for as long as it would exist. Just kidding. In 2013, Microsoft hired some folks from the Age of Empires modding community to come out with a new expansion called The Forgotten, which finally gave us Slavs. Yes, just Slavs. Might as well just call the Britons, Franks, and Teutons West Germans, but okay, we'll take it. We finally have Eastern Europeans. Oh, and also Incas. Yeah, with the same architectural style as the Mayans and the Aztecs. The same paintless, ruined style that looks more like the temples that exist today than they did 600 years ago. And Eagle Warriors, which were an important noble warrior class to the Aztecs, but the Incas lived literally on a different continent, and the Incas didn't have anything even resembling Eagle Warriors, and yet 'twas Eagle Warriors they had. And this was all fine to the Age of Empires team. I tell you all this to tell you what transpired in those 13 years between the Conquerors and the Forgotten. During this time, Age of Empires 3 came out. Now, Age of Empires 3 was a total failure, but it happens to be my favorite game in the series. While Age of Empires 1 had very little difference between civilizations and Age of Empires 2 had a little more, Age of Empires 3 gave you civilizations that played completely differently, so you really felt the uniqueness of your own playstyle. You also had a more face-to-face interaction with your city in the form of a home city that you could customize, which also affected gameplay and let you be even more unique. Want to focus hard on building a strong economy, or do you want to build up your home city deck into an early rush? It's up to you. At the time, this was really just quite complicated compared to Age of Empires 2 though, and players hated it. I tell you now about the variety among civilizations and the many ways you could play those civilizations to tell you this. Age of Empires 3 originally only contained European nations and playable civilizations, and took place between the 16th and the 20th centuries. That's right, in the colonial era. As your chosen European civilization, you fought with other European civilizations in the New World, sometimes allying yourself with minor Native American civilizations like the Iroquois, which in real life, by the game's release in 2005, was already a name starting to be phased out as an ethnonym because it was entirely European in origin. A couple years later, the game's first expansion was released, and the Iroquois actually became their own playable civilization. The Iroquois, along with the Sioux, and the Aztecs, none of which used names that would have been used by the people themselves. Now, before you jump on me, I'm not talking about names that were adapted from relevant language into English. It's not like, we call the Chinese, Chinese, and Chinese is from China, but China obviously isn't a Chinese word. It is, however, probably, ultimately from the Chinese word Qin, which was the name of the first Chinese state that travelers from the West would have encountered. So it is still an endonym, a name that people called themselves, just gone through borrowing after borrowing and has been mutated into its current form in English. Chinese is okay. Iroquois, on the other hand, was a word that seems to have just been invented out of thin air by the French to describe the Haudenosaunee. It doesn't actually mean anything. It's not even related to a word that any of the members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy would have said. The name Sioux ultimately comes from an exonym, something that they were called by another nation, in this case the Ojibwe people, who are unrelated to any of the Lakota or Dakota people and were typically positioned as their enemies. And in case you're wondering about Aztec, this too isn't an endonym. The word actually wasn't coined at all until a man named Alexander von Humboldt in the 19th century. My boy Alex, if you can't tell by the name, definitely was not an Aztec himself, but he was quite enamored with the cultures of Latin America, and thought it would be really cool to take the civilization of people who called themselves the Nahua or the Mexica people, take them and say, hey, you deserve a much cooler name that I'm about to give you. In your mythology, it says that you came from an ancient place to the north called Aztlan, and you add the suffix tech to indicate people who came from a certain place, so I'm going to be this super diligent white man and give you this very Nahua-sounding name, the Aztec. And there really isn't a way to make this not sound ridiculous, because it is, and it's stuck because old Alex happened to be the guy to go to for scholarly books and information on Latin America at the time. So, back to Age of Empires 3. The good news is that we now have 3 playable indigenous civilizations. The bad news? They all have the wrong names. And that's not the only thing that's wrong. There's a lot of kind of tasteless stuff in there, like fire pits their villagers dance around, and the ability for their war chief to befriend wild animals. You know, the noble savage stuff that white liberals think is generally just fine and okay. But anyway, with the addition of these, and then later another expansion that gave us civilizations from South and East Asia, Age of Empires 3 officially became the most global of Age of Empires games. This expansion included cool stuff like an Indian campaign about the struggle against the rather nasty East India Trading Company, and some not so cool stuff, like one that takes the conspiracy theory that China reached Central America to inspire native religion and plays it straight. But anyway, then it was forgotten about for 13 years. Meanwhile, starting with The Forgotten in 2013 and continuing up until today, Age of Empires 2 has continued to get new content. It now has a total of 42 different civilizations, and was the first in the series to include anywhere in Africa that wasn't Egypt, with the Ethiopians, Berbers, and Mali. And while they did give Africa its own architectural set, it kept to the game's formula of having more or less the same units for everyone. So, you got Mali swordsmen with European-style shields and plate armor. But hey, at least they didn't call the Berbers Moors. Progress! So, by 2020 we've got a historical strategy game series that's like a little problematic. Not super problematic, not problematic enough for the liberals to actually take notice and start pushing, but problematic enough that history buffs and the unfortunately small voices of the affected people themselves speak up about it, only to be generally told to stop whining about every little thing by the gamers. You might be watching this now and might feel the same way. Oi, ferret, they're just names. It's not like they're calling people Negroes or including the slave trade as a civilization bonus. Calm your furry tits. But names do matter. If you can't even call yourself what you would like to be called, can you even be said to have self-determination? Can you even be said to have dignity? Whether that's as a nation or whether that's as a person, we all know you don't dead name trans people, you call them by what they want to be called. Doing otherwise robs them of the most basic respect you ought to afford anybody, right? Well, the same thing applies to nations. You call them by what they themselves want to be called. You don't have a say in that. So when Microsoft started remastering Age of Empires 3, finally to be released in 2020, and different groups were telling them what had been the problems of the game for years, well, they listened. Yeah, you didn't expect that, did you? They did listen, at least somewhat. From what I can tell, they listened to English-speaking groups. Specifically, they listened to the Lakota people and the people of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They changed those names. They listened to the fact that those people didn't dance in circles around fire pits. They didn't mine gold. They didn't make friends with
every rock and tree and creature.
So they took that shit out. They even actually got voice actors from the nations they represent to voice those units. Generally, when you're listening to the units in Age of Empires, they're being voiced by voice actors that don't speak the language at all. And sometimes it shows. People have noted anachronisms, mispronunciations, or just outright the wrong words. So the Age of Empires 3 team got native speakers from the Haudenosaunee and the Lakota to make sure it's done right. And finally, they recognized that the colonial age not only now applies to barely half of the game's playable civilizations, but it's also kind of a gross term to suggest that a whole span of time in the game is dedicated to the domination and extermination of other cultures. So they removed that as well, replacing it with the Commerce Age. And people got so mad. This game that no one even gave a damn about before suddenly had all the gamers coming out of the woodwork to decry Microsoft as woke in all the wrong ways. Why did you have to take away my dancing villagers? Why is the new voice acting so quiet? Why'd you make the Iroquois so darn hard to pronounce? Why did you change the colonial age? Are you trying to erase colonialism? And no. They changed the campaign to better represent Indigenous people as something other than antagonists or secondary characters in their own story. So when the definitive edition came out, and I bought it like the absolute whore for this series that I am, you can be sure the first thing I did was give it a scathing negative review on Steam. Yep. Why? Well, the game was pretty broken. I was really disappointed with how everything looked, and the replacement for the fire pit just had no animations at all, so all I could think of was you now have Indigenous people standing around and doing nothing. Very nice, Microsoft. But really importantly to me, was I think the most egregious intercultural faux pas the team has ever committed. In the Conquerors expansion, to Age of Empires 2, the Aztecs were of course given voices for their own units. And as I talked about a little bit earlier, in both Age of Empires 2 and 3, units tend to speak their own language. Koreans speak Korean. Japanese speak Japanese. Franks and Britons speak the period-appropriate versions of French and English, which is really cool. And the Aztecs speak gibberish. No one can actually tell what they're meant to be saying. Some of what they speak seems to be a mix of different Mayan languages, all of which are completely unrelated to the Nahuatl that would have been spoken in the Aztec Empire, along with some apparent nonsense that, as far as I can tell, no one has found an origin for. And Microsoft certainly hasn't come out to say what exactly it's supposed to be. In the Aztecs in Age of Empires 3, they just reused those nonsensical voice lines. Well, it's a good thing in the 2020 Definitive Edition re-release they probably fixed all of that, right? Nope. There are 1.7 million native speakers of Nahuatl. It would not have been hard to find somebody to do it, and yet, there isn't a single Nahuatl word in Age of Empires to this day. The Aztecs, still called the Aztecs, still speak a ridiculous hodgepodge of Mayan languages and made-up words. And it's for that reason that my negative review still remains. It isn't that I don't regret it somewhat, though, because despite this really personally jarring mistake, the game has continued to improve. And despite what I ever imagined would happen, they actually released some more content in the form of a whole new expansion called the African Royals. This gave us 2 new African civilizations, both of which have appropriate names and languages, the Hausa and the Ethiopians, as well as plenty of North African maps, animals, lore, really cool stuff. And these civilizations are represented, to my mind, as a non-black ferret, represented really well. They stray entirely from European notions of what Africa is like, and show us all the beauty and complexity of these nations at their height. The grand universities and fortresses of the Hausa, the expertly hewn monasteries and palaces of Ethiopia. The treasures you find in Africa reflect the rich philosophical histories of these empires, and there's honey badgers. And seeing all these new African maps made me realize, not only is Age of Empires 3 now once again the most expansive of the Age of Empires series, but there are only a few areas of the globe that haven't yet been represented. You don't have Australia. That's going to take some working with. I would love to see some of these nations represented, but it would have to be done carefully to respect their pre-feudal roots. And Europe. Yeah, of all the places in the world with state-level civilizations, Europe itself is actually the last to be included. Obviously, we had European civilizations, but we only ever saw them in the New World. And it wasn't until this year that Europe was finally included. And it's playing those maps that made me want to make this video. I expected to see Europe like we tend to see Europe in medieval games. Beautiful, clean, full of knightly aristocracies and gorgeous architecture and exciting new technology. Instead, it's represented, really, just as it was. No better or worse than Africa or Asia or the Americas. Still wild, still with unstable, often tribal alliances and conflicts between nations and families. Just as the Hispania map has Carib blowgunners and warrior priests are prominent among the Aztecs, Europe still has crackpot doctors living out in the wilderness. It isn't giving us a glowing picture of a grand, civilized Europe. It's just what it should be. Just what it was. Or as close as you could probably get in a real-time strategy game anyway. So just now, maybe you can start to tell why Age of Empires 3 is my favorite in the series. I haven't even talked much about the gameplay, but apart from the variety not only between but within civilizations that I talked about before, where each one of them plays entirely differently and you can make them play entirely differently yet again depending on how you build your home city deck, I really do like how it plays. In general, games are a bit faster because your melee unit is often something of an arsonist himself. You can in theory end games in Age 2, rather than basically needing to wait until you have siege like you do in Age of Empires 2. A rush can be definitive, but it can also be the end of you because retreating is hard. Unless your unit is specifically made for raiding, they're actually slowed down when fleeing, so you have to commit. You have to take that chance. You can't just micro-nerd your way out of a situation. You can't dodge arrows or bullets. That isn't a thing. You can't cheese your way through a game either. You can't drop a villager into an unattentive enemy's base to build towers. Instead, the game is all about building your economy, building map control, and building confidence in your army composition to take out your opponent in a glorious push. using your own unique units and advantages your civilization and your playstyle give you. All this on top of, well, I love Age of Empires 2. And if I'm playing the Incas in Age of Empires 2, which I do, I tend to tower rush because cheese is fun, and then maybe transition into training the Eagle Warriors that the Incas have for some reason that are really good. But guess what? The Incas also exist in Age of Empires 3. I neglected to tell you that, didn't I? You might say it's a cool reveal. And almost all the Inca buildings are unique. From their houses, to their military buildings, to their massive fortresses, to their chincha rafts manned by the slingers that the Incas are famous for. I'll build up these beautiful stone fortifications in front of a trade empire of Dombos to solidify a large economy and construct a large and diverse military, topped off with the Tupac Rebellion that converts your villagers into soldiers. You can feel the love of history here. Age of Empires 3 has gone from being a game happily waving around the banner of colonialism with a fleeting and haphazard representation of colonized peoples, to a rather shaky re-release that does admittedly try to address some of these issues, to now finally being a genuinely really good strategy game that is actually trying to showcase these different nations, both oppressed and oppressors, in fair, fun, and respectful ways. And hey, yeah, the X Fire Pit building is now animated. So this video might not be the most leftoid thing I've ever done, but it's kind of a thank you note to the Age of Empires 3 developers for taking these steps, while also being, I guess, sort of an apology for my Steam review. But I gotta tell you, it's staying up, because I want you to keep moving in this positive direction. There's still work to be done. There's still at least one civilization whose name needs changing. Call them the Mexica. That's what they called themselves. That's what they continue to call themselves. And please hire some Nahuatl speakers to voice them. Get in touch with me. I promise you I'll find you some people. If you can do that, I'll change my review for whatever it's worth and add a little note to this video. Bye now.